After months of manipulation, Alexis agreed to meet her new friend online. And as soon as she got into his car, she realized that this person was a different person than she believed him to be. He chained her and forced her to have sex for money, and he committed this
subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements and questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I recognize myself for an opening statement. The spread of terrorism and extremist ideas has claimed countless lives, destroyed hundreds of communities, and spawned radical groups around the world. Women in particular have long been the victims of these radical ideas. Just last week, the terrorist group Boko Haram targeted a girls' school in Nigeria and abducted more than 100 young girls. This incident follows the 2014 abduction of 270 Nigerian schoolgirls, of which 112 are still missing. These acts are far from uncommon among Islamic terrorist organizations. Across the world, jihadist networks subject women and young girls to horrendous human rights violations. These male-dominated extremist groups frequently deny basic rights like access to education or political representation to women as a core component of their ideas. Terrorist groups like ISIS, Boko Haram are often the worst abusers of women, forcing them into marriages and sexual slavery. It should be no surprise that the status of women in a society is often an important indicator as to how vulnerable that society is to violence and radicalization. Yet, while being one of the primary targets of terrorist groups, women are also being radicalized and recruited into these groups. Some support the group's operations, enforce its laws, marry and bear children of terrorist fighters. Others actually commit these acts of terror. In recent years, as many as 3,000 women have traveled to the Middle East to join ISIS, with many becoming female suicide bombers. Despite the marginalization and brutality of women in extremist-held lands, repressive regimes, persistent conflict, and poor development policies sometimes create conditions that make groups like ISIS to be seen as an opportunity for women. Once radicalized, terrorist organizations will leverage the status of women to further their violent goals. For example, Boko Haram has exploded cultural perceptions of women in Nigeria as nonviolent and unlikely to be involved in terrorism, to use them as intelligence and recruiting tools. In our effort to combat terrorism and extremism abroad, we have neglected the important role of women and how they can play in actually preventing radicalization and facilitate peace building in areas long worn by violence. Women are well placed in homes, schools, and communities to challenge extremist narratives. Research shows that anti-terrorism messages can be more effectively spread by women because they are more directly involved with those most vulnerable to the terrorist recruitment of the world's youth. Given their importance in families and communities, it's essential that women, both at home and abroad, are more meaningfully enlisted in the fight against terrorism. 2 years ago, as French police hunted for the mastermind behind the Paris attacks that killed 130, it was a woman who reported the whereabouts to the police. Her role as a surrogate mother to family members of the attacker allowed her access and trust that men unfamiliar to the family would have never gained. Her brave action prevented a planned follow-on attack. Examples such as this demonstrate the crucial role of women in spotting emerging violence and gaining trust within families and communities. Unfortunately, we often lack their perspectives because women are underrepresented in governments where terrorist groups are most active. Because of their better ability to build a trust, women have proven to improve the outcomes of conflict mediation and peace building. A study of 40 peace processes in 35 countries over the past 30 years found that when women were involved, more agreements were reached, implemented, and sustained. As more and more terrorist groups threaten our country, our allies, and our interests, it is vital that we leverage the talents and perspectives of women as part of a bigger approach to ensure security at home and abroad. It must be the policy of the United States that as we work in societies damaged by years of war and political unrest, we empower women to have a larger voice. In this fight against terrorism, we need everybody at the table, especially women. And I will yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member, Mr. Keating, for his opening statements.
Thank you, Chairman Poe. I'd like to thank our panel for joining us on this very important topic. Quite frankly, in 2001, No one imagined how much the threat of terrorism would indeed change. The days of countering terrorism through undermining and eliminating self-contained terrorist organizations is over. Despite many successes, we often feel like we're playing a rigged game of whack-a-mole, and all the while, the organized groups like Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram continue to survive and evolve as ever-present and legitimate threats to the United States and our allies. Our security agencies here in the United States and those of our allies have been working tirelessly to adapt to a changing landscape. And as we've come to understand, the new terrorist threats we face in foreign fighters and lone wolves and often unpredictable radicalization of vulnerable individuals in our communities, fortunately, we have the ability to learn more about these new approaches and new actors who are critical to the fight against terrorism, and actors who really should have been a part of the strategy all along. Civil society, the rule of law, and the focus of our hearing this afternoon, women, are integral to our success in countering the terrorist threats we face today. By consistently failing to meaningfully engage women in combating terrorism and extremism, we're failing to not only address part of the problem, but we're failing to pursue a whole new range of solutions. Our mission is to be most effective and efficient in keeping Americans and our allies safe from terrorism, and to have this exclusion continue or not to maximize this important resource is unacceptable. Roughly half the world is made up of women. Half the victims of terrorism are women. In communities struggling to rebuild and achieve security and stability, again, after a terrorist threat has finally been temporarily kept at bay, roughly half the people in that community will be women. And yet, when we look at the breakdown of who's empowered to have a meaningful role in combating terrorism, women are severely underrepresented. At a time when resources are tight, when we can't seem to have a single sustained success story of eliminating terrorist threat anywhere, and when instead the problem might be growing, why are we tying one of our hands behind our back? When we think about radicalization and terrorism, there's always warning signs. A parent notices her child's behavior and notices whether there's been a recent change in that behavior. A teacher notices one of her students has been increasingly withdrawn in class. They change their appearance or their opinions have started to become more extreme. Often women are on the front lines of noticing these warning signs associated with radicalization. What resources do they have when they're faced with this situation? Far too often, women don't know or trust who they can go to with that information, or worse yet, when some of them brought their concerns to law enforcement, they're ignored. Fortunately, this has been changing thanks to the incredible strength and determination of countless women around the world, as well as many men who early on understood the importance of supporting these women in their mission. Thanks to them, we finally started to move in the right direction. Congress passed the Women, Peace, and Security Act last fall, which will require a strategy be in place to promote the participation of women in U.S. foreign policy. More research has been done to show the benefits achieved when women have a seat at the table, and more women than ever before have been able to join the ranks of their male counterparts in the security sector and in leadership posts where they have a real role in fighting terrorism, shaping peaceful resolutions to conflict. We still have a very long way to go, however, and the threats we face from terrorism are not going to sit patient while we get there. The whole-of-government approach does not mean listening to and working with just half the resources we have available to us in tackling these threats. I therefore look forward to hearing our witnesses today. I hope that we can discuss lessons learned so far, the gaps that still remain in including women alongside men in efforts to combat terrorism, and what we can do about it. What we should be doing in terms of our foreign assistance, our military assistance, our diplomatic missions, and our intelligence missions. What must men start doing differently? And what changes do we need to start making things happen now so that our counterterrorism strategy is no longer just half of what it could be. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. And without objection, the chair will recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Poe and Mr. Keating, for convening this meeting. For too long, women's diverse roles in countering and supporting violent extremism has been overlooked, and it just needs more attention. I'm glad we're doing that today, and I thank you, all of you, for being here. Ignoring a half of the population in the fight against radicalism leaves us with a strategic blind spot. And when it comes to violent extremism, women can be victims, preventers, and perpetrators. Terrorists do not succumb their victims only with bullets and bombs, as we know. Rape, trafficking, abuse of women has become an all-too-common weapon of war. Women are often the first targets of terrorist organizations. ISIS has abducted and raped thousands of women and girls, and even used income generated from human trafficking to fill their coffers. In Nigeria, Boko Haram has kidnapped hundreds of girls and subjected them to countless horrors. Last week, another 110 girls went missing from a group that attacked another school. The Taliban have attacked girls in Afghanistan and Pakistan, we heard about that wonderful young girl, Malala, simply for trying to get an education. And sadly, women are not always the innocent. They also support and engage in terrorism. In sub-Saharan Africa, 3 out of 4 child suicide bombers are girls, and 18% of all our suicide bombers are women. And I'm sure there's a lot of complicated reasons for that hopefully some of you will address. When the former wife of a Boko Haram commander was asked why she willingly joined the group, she said they offered her more money, power, protection than what she was getting within her own community. A recent research has shed light on factors that lead women to be recruited into terrorist organizations: false promises of protection and escape from abuse at home, and leadership opportunities. But we still have a limited understanding of what's driving these women in the wrong direction. And as mentioned by my colleagues, women can be and should be on the front lines of countering terrorism, uniquely situated to detect early signs of radicalization in youth, especially as mothers. And many times their warnings are disregarded, and we have to figure out ways to empower them, and I hope we'll hear some suggestions on that. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to wait till it's my turn to ask. And again, I thank you all for being here on this very important subject.
The gentlelady yields back her time. I now will recognize each of the witnesses, and I would advise all of you that your statements are prepared. Your prepared statements are part of the record, and try to keep your statements to no more than 5 minutes. And then each member of the panel, or each member of the committee, will ask you questions. Dr. Valerie Hudson is professor at the George H.W. Bush School of Government, and also is the chair of the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University, where she directs the program of Women, Peace, and Security. She was previously taught at Brigham Young, Northwestern, and Rutgers Universities. Mr. Harris Rafiq is CEO of the Quillen International. He is currently a member of the United Kingdom's Prime Minister's Community Engagement Forum Task Force, and was formerly a member of the UK government's task force looking at countering extremism in response to the 2005 terrorist bombings in London. Ms. Farhat Popal serves as the manager of the Women's Initiative Fellowship and the Afghan Women's Project at the George W. Bush Institute at SMU, not to be confused with the Texas A&M institution where your cohort, Dr. Hudson, works. Previously, she worked with the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And Ms. Majella Biggio is a senior fellow at the Women and Foreign Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, she served as Director of Human Rights and Gender on the White House National Security Council staff. Dr. Hudson, we will start with you, and you have 5 minutes. And when that red light comes on, that means you're supposed to stop.
I'll do
if
my
you
best.
See it.
Thank you so much.
In case you were wondering what that meant.
I'm grateful to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hope my short remarks on the linkages between male-female relations, radicalization, and terrorism may be of use to you. My research team at the Women's Stats Project has been examining the relationship between gender inequality, marriage market obstruction on the one hand, and the security and stability of nation-states on the other for some time now. This research is most recently funded by the Minerva Initiative of the U.S. Department of Defense. In our efforts, we've concentrated on women's personal empowerment or disempowerment at the household level, rather than examining broader indicators such as female literacy, female labor force participation, or female parliamentary representation. Rather, we examine things that are closer to home for women, such as property and inheritance rights, rights in marriage, rights in divorce and custody, level of violence against women in the home. In total, 11 such indicators of women's empowerment or disempowerment at the household level. Then, using large N multivariate modeling techniques, we found that this disempowerment, household disempowerment measure is strongly, significantly related to multiple measures of political instability, autocracy, lack of freedom, corruption, and internal conflict in the state. In fact, the overall best predictor of state stability and security was not our control variables, such as how urbanized the society was, how fractionalized the society was, colonial status, and several others, but rather women's disempowerment at the household level was the most predictive variable. Why would there be such a strong and significant association? We argue that the character of male-female relations at the household level is, if you will, the first political order within any human society. And this order shapes the development of the nation-state in indelible ways. If the household is an autocracy where men rule over those who are different from them, women, if men feel they have the right to use physical force against those who are different from them, women, if men feel entitled to greater access to household resources than those who are different from them, women, this is the template that will be applied to all who are deemed different in the larger society. This explains why Ellen Bjarnegard and her co-authors have found that men holding deeply gender unequal beliefs also hold far more hostile attitudes towards minorities and foreign nations, and are significantly more likely to be involved in committing political violence. How women are treated by men becomes, if you will, a boot camp, training men in the arts of violent and exploitative autocracy. Does the boot camp hypothesis hold for terrorism as well? Yes, it does. Again, using the same techniques, we found every measure of terrorism we examined, such as the political terror scale, terrorism impact score, terrorism fatalities, was strongly, significantly associated with women's personal disempowerment at the household level. Train men to terrorize women, and you train them in terrorism. Relatedly, this also helps explain why the overwhelming majority of mass shooters in the U.S. have histories of domestic violence. We also undertook a second angle of investigation into the links to terrorism. We examined nations' comparative rates of production of foreign fighters going to fight for ISIS. Adjusting for total population size, which nations are producing more or less of these foreign fighters? Using data from the SUFIN group on estimated numbers from each country, again, a strong and significant relationship between the national production rate of foreign fighters and our measure of women's personal disempowerment at the household level. This is a second corroboration of the boot camp hypothesis. And I'd like to note this particular research was conducted by my graduate capstone research team at the Bush School of Government and Public Service for the Office of Global Women's Issues of the State Department. There's also additional ways by creating structural instabilities. Well, you talked about Boko Haram. Well, one of the structural instabilities is bride price, the price that a groom must pay to a bride's father to marry. Bride price is subject to extreme inflation and bubbles over time. and this means that young men are priced out of the marriage market. Boko Haram kidnaps these girls so that young men without bride prices may marry. In like manner, polygyny and sex ratio alteration also create chronic instability within the system, goading young men into grievance and political terrorism. In conclusion, then, by providing a training course in terrorism, creating structural instability within a society, and disempowering the very voices that might be most persuasive arguing against terrorism, women, the character of male-female relations is a strong determinant of the horizon for peace and security within the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hudson. Mr. Rafiq, thank you for being here. Thank you for coming across the pond, so to speak, to be here to testify at this hearing. We appreciate it very much. You may proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and Member Frankel for inviting me to travel across the pond and speak on this very important subject. My colleague, my Executive Director, Quilliam US, would have been here, but he's in Nigeria right now, training male and female members of civil society on critical thinking to tackle terrorism. Quilliam is an organization that operates in 3 countries, the UK, US, and Canada, and it's an organization that was set up by former extremists to challenge Islamist terrorism and Islamist ideology. And I think it's very important that we use the correct terminology and we use Islamism and differentiate between Islam, because just as there's a difference between the word social and socialism, there is a difference between Islam, which is a religion that's practiced by Muslims around the world in many different ways. Islamism is a distinct political ideology when merged with certain Salafi Wahhabi theology, is one interpretation and is part of a civil war that's going on within Islam right now. Chairman Poe, you're absolutely right that women are ideally placed to be primary and secondary intervention providers because of their proximity, their prestige, and their passion. They are much more effective than any government initiatives direct or any governments can be, and quite often more effective than men when it comes to providing these interventions for young male and female members of their families. In order to understand the best way to actually look at projects to prevent terrorism, we need to look at the radicalization process, and there are 4 key aspects to it. The first one, there has to be a grievance, whether it's genuine, partial, or perceived. The second one, there has to be a charismatic recruiter or recruiters that will recruit people who have these grievances. The third thing is there has to be an identity crisis. People have to be told that the only way they're going to find solutions is if they join a particular Islamist gang. And the fourth one is the ideology of Islamism itself that actually provides solutions for some of these people. In case of women and our groundbreaking research, which I co-authored called Caliphates, Women and the Appeal of Islamic State, the 4 main solutions for women were the following. The first one, the promise of empowerment. The second one, the promise of deliverance. The third one, the promise of participation. And the fourth one, the promise of piety. Once we understand these processes, we can start looking at projects and ways of actually preventing terrorism. And I just want to touch very briefly on 4 projects that we've worked on, that we've ran or worked on, and you can read more about them in the written testimony. The first one is a current project in Nigeria, which is around critical thinking, which my Executive Director, Mohammed Fraser Rahim, is delivering right now. It's on critical thinking. The second one is AMAID, which is the American Muslims Against Terrorism and Extremism. We run that with our partners in the US, Masjid Mohammed, and also with Green Street Communications. And in fact, the project is led by an African-American Muslim woman, Jamila Fraser. And since its launch in January the 8th of this year, we've reached 705,000 people, out of which 86,000 people have been women. And I can go into the demographics a little bit more. The third one is the rehabilitation of former terrorists within the UK. There have been a number of people that have been released here in the US over the last 12 months, and we've worked with some of them, male and female, and there'll be some news and some announcements that we'll have where we've de-radicalized, used models that we've used in other countries to de-radicalize individuals here in the US. And by the way, there are just under 20 further people that will be convicted terrorists in the US that will be released within the next 12 months. The fourth one is FATE, which is Families Against Terrorism and Extremism. And that's one of our flagship programs where we've operated in 22 countries with 115 organizations. 10,000 providers of services have been the beneficiary of training. We've upskilled, we've trained people in North Africa and in Central Europe as well. And again, we've helped them build messages and really used women and families to actually become this bulwark against terrorism. There are about 12 recommendations in my testimony, but the gist really of the recommendations are around the following. At this moment in time, we are actually playing whack-a-mole. We are actually focusing on a strategy that is about terrorism prevention. And once we actually contain one global jihadist terrorist threat, there is a new one that pops up. But ISIS and Al-Qaeda didn't breed extremism, extremism bred them. In order to actually become more effective, we have to recognize that there is a global jihadist insurgency, and we also need an effective counter-extremism strategy, which actually works with women, empowers women, and empowers civil society as a whole to take on this challenge and counter the narratives that would radicalize our youngsters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Popal.
Chairman Poe, Representative Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to appear here today. My name is Farhat Popal. I work on the Women's Initiative at the nonprofit, nonpartisan George W. Bush Institute in Dallas, Texas. I'm also Afghan American, so this issue is of great importance to me. At the Bush Institute, we believe women are essential to the development of peaceful, open, prosperous societies. Our Afghan Women's Project has worked to ensure the expansion of women's rights in Afghanistan, and we regularly engage with remarkable leaders, from civil society advocates to peace builders to first ladies. We also support Mrs. Laura Bush in her role as honorary co-chair of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council. My comments today will focus on women's role in countering violent extremism in Afghanistan. I will also discuss how women's meaningful inclusion in leadership can help build resilient communities. Here are the 3 points I'd like to leave with you today. First, Afghan women drive education, growth, and self-reliance. They are essential to Afghanistan's stability, and we must continue to support them. Second, Afghan women help build resilient communities and participate in peace building at all levels of society. We must ensure their voices are represented in the peace process. And third, what happens elsewhere in the world matters here at home. It is in our national security and moral interest to support sustainable development in Afghanistan. Afghan women and girls have made enormous strides in areas such as education and employment, but continue to be impacted by gender-based violence, limited access to justice, and violent extremism. In the 2017 survey of the Afghan people by the Asia Foundation, 92% of Afghans say they fear encountering the Taliban, and 94% fear encountering ISIS. I share this to show both the magnitude of the problem and the Afghan people's rejection of extremism. All Afghans benefit from effective CVE efforts, but Afghan women gain the most. They also have the most to lose if their hard-won rights are negotiated away. At the family and village level, Afghan women play a key role in mediating conflict, building trust and dialogue in the community, and counseling family members. With over 63% of the population under the age of 25, mothers also can have a profound influence on their children through education. Today, thanks to the US and Afghan governments and the international community, more than 9.2 million children are enrolled in school, of which almost 40% are girls. And the percentage of college-age students enrolled in higher education has risen from 1% in 2001 to almost 10% today. At the national level, 12 out of 63 members of the High Peace Council are women. This visible presence is important, but women must also have actual influence and authority. In the 2017 initiation of the Afghan-led Kabul process, only 2 of 47 representatives were women. This marginalizes their presence and their voice. Women have been instrumental members of provincial peace councils, encouraging local insurgents to participate in talks and facilitating the release of hostages. As Chairman Poe mentioned, research shows that women's meaningful participation in a peace negotiation makes the resulting agreement 35% more likely to last at least 15 years. CVE is also about more than security. It's about creating resilient communities that are built upon strong social connections, trust, and dialogue. They're also built on inclusion. Afghan women are a key part of these efforts. Last October, the Bush Institute hosted 14 women leaders from the Middle East, North Africa, and Afghanistan who are advancing economic opportunity and ultimately peace and prosperity in their countries. We met Nadia Behboudi of the American University of Afghanistan, who is working to support women-owned businesses through training, capital, and access to business and IT support. We reconnected with Manija Wafiq, featured in our book, We Are Afghan Women, Voices of Hope, who advocates for women's economic rights through the Afghanistan Women Chamber of Commerce and Industry. According to the Chamber, women entrepreneurs have invested more than $66 million in the Afghan economy and created more than 47,000 jobs. Afghan women have a staunch advocate in First Lady Rula Ghani. Last fall, Mrs. Ghani joined Mrs. Bush on Capitol Hill in their roles as honorary co-chairs of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, a key public-private partnership that was established in 2002. They discussed the importance of advanced training and mentoring and urged us to see Afghan women as the leaders and partners they are, not as victims. If I can leave you with one key point, it is this: women's meaningful inclusion in all aspects of society, social, political, and economic, is essential for Afghanistan's stability and prosperity. Here's how we can help. First, we must consider local contexts and causes of violent extremism to inform effective CVE strategies and women's role in them. And by building local capacity, communities can sustainably lead their own efforts. Second, we must continue to support and fund sustainable development in Afghanistan that is aligned with national-level policies and priorities. Stability requires equal access to justice, respect for human rights, effective rule of law and good governance, and transparent, effective, and accountable institutions. It also necessitates access to quality education. These efforts will help undermine extremist narratives and will take both public and private sector engagement. Perhaps most importantly, we must continue to invest in women and guarantee their meaningful inclusion in peace building. The Bipartisan Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017 is an important step in this direction, but it must be implemented and funded to make a difference. In sum, Afghan women are making a profound impact on a daily basis, and it is in our interest to support them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Bijil.
Thank you. Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. By convening this hearing, Congress is sending a bipartisan signal that the United States can no longer afford to ignore how women's participation will improve the effectiveness of counterterrorism efforts. As you noted, extremist groups use women to their advantage, recruiting them on the one hand as facilitators and martyrs, and on the other hand benefiting both strategically and financially from their subjugation. Yet counterterrorism policy has not been as effective at understanding how women can improve security efforts. We see extremist groups target women and girls. We see some groups use sexual violence to terrorize populations, displace civilians, and generate revenue. Extremist groups also recruit women to act as informants and facilitators. Close to 20% of foreign fighters from Europe who joined the Islamic State are female. And women have proven effective in all roles assigned to them by extremist groups, including as suicide bombers. When groups use female suicide bombers, they are taking advantage of the relative absence of women in police and military forces. It makes it easier for women to hide suicide devices, knowing that there is a good chance they will not encounter a female security official and therefore will not be searched. While extremist groups are strategically using women to their advantage, there is an opportunity for counterterrorism policy to draw more on the opportunities of how women can contribute. Women are already on the front lines of countering violent extremism, as we witness female police officers engaging with local communities to prevent violent extremism, female imams and other religious leaders preaching religious tolerance, and women countering efforts to radicalize their husbands, children, and communities. On the military side, former U.S. Special Operations Commander Admiral William McRaven observed that including women opens up possibilities for interactions with local populations that increases the effectiveness of the overall mission. Despite these advantages, U.S. government policy and programs pay little attention to the role of women. To strengthen these efforts, the U.S. government should pursue the following steps. First, the forthcoming U.S. National Counterterrorism Strategy and the National Strategy for Countering Violent Extremist Groups should include attention to and investment in women's roles, both in terms of how the U.S. government can involve women leaders, as well as steps to de-radicalize and reintegrate female fighters. Efforts to address women's roles should not be detached from broader security sector policy and initiatives, which result in missed opportunities where women's contributions could have improved the effectiveness of U.S. operations. Second, to maximize the return on defense investments, the U.S. government should increase resources to facilitate women's involvement in efforts to counter terrorism and violent extremism. Investment by the United States in this area has been limited to small grants or standalone programs. The Defense Department, the State Department, and USAID should invest more in women's roles to counter terrorism and violent extremism. This includes through prevention-related funds, such as ESF, but also security funds, such as anti-terrorism and law enforcement programs. Currently, these do too little to support the role of female security officials, for example. And with the proposed cuts to diplomacy and development, there's a risk that funding for women's contributions to security will be decreased, which will in turn decrease the effectiveness of U.S. security investments. Retired General Allen, former commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, observed from his time that by empowering women, we can make them a force to reduce the reality of radicalization, calling it an investment that pays off in virtually every occasion where I've had the opportunity to see it. He advocated increasing funding to help women counter terrorism, including by making Defense Department money available for State Department-run programs in this area. Third, the U.S. government should address the specific needs and experiences of women. U.S. efforts to reintegrate returning fighters into communities should address the motivations and grievances of female fighters, whether in Colombia, Europe, or elsewhere. Finally, in light of evidence that terrorist and violent extremist groups are exploiting the absence of women in security sectors, U.S. security cooperation efforts should help countries to increase the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women in their security sectors. Such efforts should target women in uniformed roles and in leadership positions in order to ensure they can shape engagements with communities and influence policy decisions. U.S. government training programs should require that all countries participating in U.S.-provided security and justice programs should send delegations of at least 30% women to ensure that women have the opportunity to benefit from our investments. Congress and this committee can work to hold the administration accountable for ensuring that its efforts to counter terrorism and violent extremism invest in an important but overlooked strategy, the inclusion of women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now recognize myself for questions. I appreciate your very good information about an issue that has not gotten much attention at all on the fight against terrorism since 9/11, really before that. And so I want to speak on behalf of the entire subcommittee that we appreciate your testimony and also your written testimony as well. It is fascinating. Let me ask this question to all four of you. You have given us a lot of information, good information, valuable information. I hope that in the fight against terrorism, if we can use that word, we refocus on the importance of the role of women in solving this problem, but also in seeing how intricately entwined women are in the whole process of fighting terrorism. And women as victims, women as enablers, women as problem solvers, all three. So be specific, and what can we do right now to change this focus and include the role of women in those areas I mentioned, primarily in fighting extremism and being enablers of extremism, if I can use those two concepts. If you can just be specific. I'll start with you, Dr. Hudson.
Oh, thank you, Chairman Poe. Very nice to address that very important question. In my line of work at the Bush School, we look at intel quite a bit. And one of the things that I've argued in previous publications is that we're not tracking the types of things that we need to track. We could have been much more aware of what was going on with groups such as Boko Haram if we had been tracking things such as bride price trajectories. One of the most fascinating pieces of research I saw came from the West African situation, which has been roiled by civil war. And they found that the rebel groups had so much more success recruiting in areas where the rate of polygamy had risen as a result of economic setbacks, pricing young men out of the market. There's also, I think, early warning to be seen in things such as sex ratio alterations. You know, we think of there being a deficit of girls in China and India, but do you know there's now 19 nations that have abnormal birth sex ratios? And they include nations that definitely need to be on our radar screen: Azerbaijan, Armenia, Moldova, Albania, and others. What I'm suggesting is that the means by which women are subordinated in these types of societies, through bride price, through polygamy, through sex ratio alteration, has to be part of our intelligence gathering, has to be part of our situational awareness, and of our understanding of early warning indicators. We've not seen that to date, and that is certainly something that I would work on. And I'll yield the floor, but I will also say that disrupting women's disempowerment at the household level, focusing on things like property rights, inheritance rights, focusing on things such as child custody, divorce, age at marriage. This is where the rubber hits the road for the empowerment of women. We have found that it's absolutely possible to disempower women and yet have a high female literacy rate, a high female labor force participation rate, high female representation in parliament. Those things don't touch the lives of women at the household level, where their voice will either be heard or ignored. So disrupting that syndrome is also important.
Mr. Rafiq.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, for your question. I think it's a very good question, and I think that there is a broader answer and then a more specific answer. The broader answer is that too often governments, the US and the UK, my home country, we suffer from a lack of political consistency in the will to see things through. Even over the last 10 years, there have been a number of very, very good projects which have established criteria of success and the metrics have been achieved, and then after a year, it's been decided that those projects aren't going to be carried on and supported anymore. But to be more specific, you asked for one or two clear things. I think, first of all, you know, people talk about this being a problem of Islam, and then other people say it's got nothing to do with Islam. The reality is it's somewhere in the middle. It has something to do with certain interpretations of Islam. And one of the things that we need to do within, certainly Western countries, a lot more, is help women become at the forefront of reform. Theological reform is absolutely critical to solving this problem. And it's reform around gender extremism, but also reform around what the role of women can be within Muslim communities. For too many people, too many families, too many Muslims that live in either the UK or the US are living almost parallel lives. There is the rule of law and what's expected and what of women generally, and what is allowed, what women are allowed to do generally, and then there are women within certainly more conservative, fundamentalist families and households. I think that reform is absolutely critical, but women need to be at the forefront of that. The other thing I think that's very, very important is if we look at the the deliverance, the piety, the empowerment promises that, that groups like ISIS have. We have to take that away from them, and we have to encourage Muslim women who are in the US and around the world to take leadership roles in actually taking on more mainstream civil society projects. Because we can do that. That'll take away the lure from groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I think that this is something that can be done both in the offline world and in the online world. You know, people talk about the internet radicalizing people. Well, nobody goes online to buy a pair of shoes or a handbag and suddenly ends up becoming a jihadist or a jihadi bride. They need to be looking for something. And there are far too many messages online that are actually recruiting young female people, young women, and we need to help young women flood the internet with good ideas.
Thank you. I'm out of time, so if we have time, we'll come back to the last two witnesses to answer that question. So save your answers that you wrote notes about. I'll yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Biggio, I recall a period when I think the earliest, or among the earlier training of women police officers. I was in Afghanistan. General Allen was there at the time, as you mentioned, and I got to see some of the early training and actually participate a little bit from my former law enforcement role before I got in Congress. But I'm curious, since then, are there more women training women now? I mean, back then, it was multi-country training, but it was men getting involved in a lot of that training. Now, women training women, have you seen that, and how successful has that been? I often envision some of our own U.S. police officers going over there training as well, but could you comment on that?
Thank you for the important question. And as you note, there have been some programs in which the U.S. government has invested in training women in security sectors, in the police and military, and working to help increase their representation. There's far too little being done right now by the U.S. government in the U.S. government security cooperation programs to really help ensure that women have the opportunity to serve and to contribute, whether in uniform or in policymaking roles.
Yeah, I do believe that. I believe that it's one thing to train. It's another thing to show the example that there are women doing that in our country as well. So thank you. Another important question I had for all of you, if you will, because it's one that I find very difficult for us as a barrier. But let me use the example of early age marriage, which I'm sure Dr. Hudson has done research into in the school. But how do we deal with the cultural norms? It's great that we're coming in and we want to do some of these things. We're beginning to get statistics and recognize the problems before they really incubate to a greater extent. Now, how do we deal with it? I mean, these countries, for instance, with early age marriages, that's the norm or it's culturally accepted there. What kind of barriers are there and how can we overcome some of those barriers?
That's terrific. Actually, that's one of the core issues, I think, that breeds unstable societies. I want to make a general comment and then make some specific comments and then defer to my colleagues. I know the CFR has done some terrific work on child marriage. I want to make sure that Ms. Biggio also can answer here. But the first one is the notion that it's cultural is very interesting because we've seen striking success in regionally based pacts, if you will, mutual understanding to raise the marriage age. So in societies where we've seen very low age of marriage, by law, the marriage age is now being raised. Okay? Now, of course, as you can imagine, there's a huge disconnect between the new law and what's actually happening on the ground. But the first step was getting the law changed, and we've seen stunning success in that over the past 10 years. The second thing that has to do that you have to do once you have the law changed is to begin to change the incentive structure. Okay? In bride price societies, fathers of the bride can't marry off their sons until they've married off their daughters first to get the bride price so they can then afford to pay the bride price back to their sons' wives' family. and that pushes the age of marriage down for girls vis-a-vis the age of marriage for boys. And so we can begin to disrupt these bride price societies, and we've seen some fascinating programs that attempt to offset the incentive to, in a sense, sell off these girls young. So I think on a conceptual level, change is possible. We've seen it in the raising of the age of marriage for girls across continents. And second of all, we've seen some very innovative programming, which the U.S. could back, that begins to disrupt these types of syndromes.
I would note just an addition on innovative programs is our opportunities to invest more in education. So where we see incentives for girls to continue their education through secondary schools, that helps to raise the age in which they marry.
Great. Just quickly, I just offer you all the opportunity. If you have, you think there's portals where we can get involved directly in our oversight capacity, or there's upcoming opportunities to comment on issues that could be important, as well as learn more about some of the things that are working. If you could feel free to contact us in the future as we move forward on this, if we can be helpful intervening or at least advocating for these things. And I'll yield back, Chairman. I have a lot of other questions. This is really an important hearing we're having.
I thank the gentleman. Chair will recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the witnesses for being here. I'm going to take this opportunity to pound a drum that the members of the committee who are here have heard me pound before, and perhaps you haven't, and I hope you will join me and assist me. While I sit on this side of the chair, which might indicate a party affiliation, I was not elected by my constituents to serve along the lines or ideas of any particular individual, whether they occupy this august legislative body or a beautiful white home on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I am a staunch advocate of the McGovern-Dole school feeding program, which we have seen cuts in over the past year, not only cuts, but proposed further cuts. I would speak to essentially the reduction in radicalization amongst males in a populace wherein females are empowered by virtue of education, and would ask you all if that's not an accurate characteristic. And I'm going to bounce around the committee with no intended offense. Ms. Biggio, am I pronouncing it right? Where you see more educated women, do you see a reduction in radicalization amongst the male population? And I apologize because I'm running a timer. And so what the school feeding program does is creates an alternative to a paradigm where in a world of subsistence farming, a mother and father might need to choose whether to put their daughter in a field to essentially cultivate the food that she might eat, or where they might allow her to gain an education because the food that she needs in order to live is provided in exchange essentially for that education. Is that an accurate characterization, Mr. Rafiq?
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, and I apologize for how I do this, but I hope that there are people listening not only in this room, but across this country, in this city, and across the world. And so when you see female educational attainment, we also see a corresponding rise in economic opportunity within a society for both men and women. Is that generally accurate, Ms. Popple?
Yes, it is.
And so when you see that rise in economic empowerment, we see a corresponding rise in things like hope, and it's perhaps cliche, but probably quite real, that a young person who has hope to aspire towards some dream or goal in the future is less likely to strap a bomb vest to themselves, for example. Is that broadly accurate, Ms. Hudson?
Absolutely. Grievance comes from despair.
And so the problem that I would see with this program is that it's hard to quantify the terrorists who were never created. In other words, we invest on the front end, we don't know what horrible acts we've prevented on the back end, and then a way that we can do this that empowers not just women but people is school feeding programs, which encourages the education of young women, which elevates almost uniformly entire societies and leads to a reduction in radicalization. I've got 2 minutes remaining. If y'all can try to keep to 30 seconds, Dr. Hudson, would you, and just bounce down the line, speak to what you think might be positive outcomes of school feeding, if this might help empower women and reduce radicalization in nations where these sorts of things are a problem?
Absolutely. The education of young people, both female and male, offers greater opportunities for economic advancement for them personally and for their families. It also offers them larger horizons in terms of greater knowledge about their world and their place in it and what they can do for good. So in all measures, both for girls and for boys, keeping them in school and allowing them a basic education through school feeding programs is laudatory.
Thank you. And I think it was, I believe, and I might misquote here, General Mattis, who said we can either provide foreign aid or we can start buying more bombs and bullets. And having served in the military, I understand that there's a time and a place for everything, but I'd rather help people than kill them. Mr. Rafiq, if you could speak to school feeding and the potential to help women and thus help reduce radicalization and reduce terrorism.
I think certainly it's one of the strategies that will pay off some dividends. However, I think there is a mistake to think that lack of education is the thing that actually drives extremism and terrorism. The World Bank did a survey of foreign fighters in ISIS, held territory, and they found that the overwhelming majority of people had a higher education, a higher social standing than the national average of the countries that they came from. Zawahiri, the current leader of Al-Qaeda, is a leading surgeon, doctor. Bin Laden was an engineer, and there are many, many other people.
And we certainly saw this, right? And I think the Bin Laden as an engineer paradigm is a great one, but we saw this even during the Mujahideen's fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Having said that, it was almost a rite of passage, and I would point out that the countries from which these fighters generally come are countries where women aren't empowered economically and oftentimes aren't educated, so it might be a chicken and egg scenario. I apologize, I'm out of time. Would the chair indulge me for 45 seconds so I can let Ms. Popple and Ms. Biggio have a moment?
I will indulge you, but you can get more questions asked in 5 minutes than anybody I've ever met, so, and faster as well. But yes, you may.
I just love being able to lead, Judge. Ms. Popple, if you could speak to it.
Yes, I actually would like to share just an example. One of the women in our book, We Are Afghan Women, Voices of Hope, Razia John, is the founder of the Zabli Education Center. It's a private K-12 girls' school that provides more than 500 girls in Afghanistan with free education, uniforms, shoes, warm coats, and meals. That school has changed men's attitudes so much so that they're willing to protect it and to send their daughters to college. And this is just one concrete example that I wanted to share with you all.
Thank you. Ms. Biggio, I apologize if I get it wrong.
Thank you. No, it's critical that you're focusing on this important issue. We certainly see that providing opportunities for women and girls, including for education, is what seeds the ground for them to be able to contribute fully to their society. And when you have space in education programs where you have boys and girls learning together, engaging in dialogue together, it forms an avenue for them to look at solving problems together in their societies as well. And so you're bringing all of your resources in that country together to advance and pursue opportunities that will then help to counter radicalization efforts.
I thank you all. Thanks to the chair and the other members for their indulgence.
Thank the gentleman from Virginia. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel, who was the person who had the idea to have this hearing. So I will recognize the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you. It takes a woman, right?
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Poe. Thank you, gentlemen, for having this hearing. Thank you, witnesses. I'm very taken by Dr. Hudson, your testimony that there were 11 indicators of empowerment at the household level that you say are the strongest predictor of terrorism. Could you quickly tell me what they are?
I brought all of my printouts for you if you ever wanted to see them.
Oh, I would like to see them.
Our 11 measures.
Without objection, they will be made part of the record.
Oh, okay.
That would be terrific. Okay, that would be great.
May I just preface it by telling you an anecdote, which is that about 10 years ago, I had a critical conversation with an Afghan female member of parliament. And I was gushing naively about how empowered she was and, new generation of Afghan women. And she said, Valerie, I could go home today and my husband could say, I divorced you 3 times and I would be divorced. And I would have nothing from my household. I would not be able to take anything with me. I would not have any place to go. She said, even if I don't get divorced, I may have no say in when my daughters and sons marry and who they marry. All right? How empowered am I really? And I realized that my focus on these broader measures was beside the point. We really need to look at the straitjacket under which women live within their own households, according to marriage and personal status law. So we look at things such as patrilocal marriage. Does the bride have to move to the groom's household upon marriage? Polygyny, cousin marriage, bride price, level of domestic violence within the home, whether there's female sanction for femicide in the home, and whether you can have legal exemption if you rape a woman if you offer to marry her.
But let me just say, let me ask you this. How did you come up with the 11 indicators, or did you first look at factors that correlate with terrorism, or you knew what the 11 were?
No, what we've done is based on almost 20 years of research. We understood that cage that's right there at the household level, and it's a cage that is created through marriage law and personal status law and property rights that disempowers the woman specifically within her household. So she can't access the resources. She doesn't have the say within her household. She can be beaten in her household and so forth.
So just to get the correlation with the terrorism, is this making women less effective in terms of stopping
You bet.
their son or maybe even their daughter from becoming?
Absolutely right.
What I'm curious, and I don't want to start a fight here, is what the other three of you think of this research.
I think the research is absolutely fantastic, and I agree on the whole, but I think we have to recognize something, that women from Western countries have left societies where they have had, they've had full rights or perceived to have full rights within the law, and they've decided to go and join ISIS for even less rights. They've decided to go and join ISIS where they could be beaten up. They could have, their husbands could have more than one wife, and in many cases did. And they decide to go there. So I think just to look at the grievances on their own, I think is not enough, because...
But I think she's talking, are you talking about, though, the grievances where the terrorism is actually taking place, or?
When I talk about grievances, I'm focusing on the grievances that young men experience that make them prey to these recruiters. So grievances over bride price, grievances over scarcity of women, grievances over lack of economic opportunity. So I completely agree with Dr. Rafiq that one of the most interesting things is to examine the situation of young women who have left countries that supposedly guarantee their rights to join places like ISIS that don't. But I don't think we disagree.
No, I think, okay, let me understand this. I think you're talking about factors that actually are motivating the men to become terrorists because the women are being segregated and there's not enough women to marry. I'm just saying there's not enough women to marry, or there's not enough mothers to say, don't do this kind of thing. I'd like to hear the other two what you think.
So I think in the context of Afghanistan, you have a lot of women in rural areas who don't have the same opportunities that women in urban areas have, and generally the level of education and the level of literacy is lower. But I think it's important to remember that, sustainable development programs, if done correctly, can really have an impact on the household level. So it doesn't necessarily have to start in the household and move outward. It can start outward and move inward. One example is the National Solidarity Program. It's a government development program that created democratically elected community development councils, and women have been a part of these councils in Afghanistan that essentially fund small-scale development projects. And one evaluation showed that the National Solidarity Program increases girls' school attendance, their quality of learning, it increases child doctor and prenatal visits, the probability that a woman would be able to go see a doctor for her illness. It even creates sort of a durable increase in the provision of local government services specifically for women. And it increases men's acceptance of female political participation. And their participation in local government, governance. So I think that's important to remember.
I agree with that it's critical that we look at what are the barriers that are preventing women from fully participating in society. And some of these are legal. There are also cultural and structural barriers that prevent women from engaging in contributing in their families, in their communities, in government, in decision-making roles in the security sector. And as we discussed earlier, it's critical that those policies and programs are shaped by the insights and perspectives that women can bring and their engagement with communities. So if there are laws or other barriers that are preventing women from engaging fully, then the resulting policies and programs will not be as effective in making sure in promoting security in their countries. So it is critical to look at the legal, structural, and cultural barriers in a country that are preventing women from being full participants and in promoting security.
Thank you. My time is up, but I hope maybe, Mr. Poe, when your turn is up, I know you when they get back to you, you had asked them to all give their suggestions. What we haven't heard, which I hope they can relay, is what is our State Department, what do our federal agencies need to start doing better? That would be a good help to us.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, and I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for having this meeting, my colleague from Florida for suggesting this meeting, and especially the witnesses for your testimony today. This has been eye-opening. I think we're talking about a very important issue. I'm going to start with Ms. Biggio, and you sparked a thought, and it actually may relate to what Ms. Frankel was saying on policy making. You use the sense of we want to have at least 30% of the people on the ground as women. I think about as we go into these programs, whether it's in uniform or not in uniform, should the programs, I'm going to frame this, feel free to push back on, is it better that we're doing separate programs for women, parallel programs for women that we might be doing at the same time for men, integrated programs where it's for both women and men, and putting that foot forward? Does that make any sense?
It does. No, thank you for that great question. So there is incredible value in integrated programming, in ensuring that men and women are together learning and setting a norm that it is through the participation of men and women together in society, serving side by side in the military, in the police, in legislatures, in government, that together, combining their insights and perspectives, they will put forward the strongest and most effective policies and programs and strategies. So it is critical that we invest and continue to pursue programs like that, which is why the 30% quota is making sure that there are women represented there. Mm-hmm. Now, there is an importance of targeted programming to provide women with professional development, networking, mentoring, to help them fast track their careers in sectors where they have been underrepresented. So when you're looking at programs to help increase the representation of women in the police and military, for example, it's important to have training programs where they are working side by side with the male colleagues with whom they will serve. And it's also important to create networking and professional development opportunities for them so that they can discuss and address the barriers that they are sharing and experiencing in their careers.
And this maybe is for the entire panel. I would imagine that in many of these communities, having integrated programs is going to face resistance. There are people who push back. How can we work with our resources, with communities in which we're engaged, to address that pushback and create a resiliency to overcome those who are against us?
So yes, wherever these programs are offered, they should be done in a culturally appropriate way. So first off, when people come to participate in training programs here in the U.S. government, in regional center, in the Defense Department's regional security studies programs, for example, or in other programs here, that's an opportunity where men and women are training together and are learning together. So in the programs that we offer, that's a critical space to ensure that we set aside slots and make sure that women have the opportunity to participate where right now they do not. In countries where there are different cultural practices, there it's taking the lead from our partners in the governments to understand what's the structure and setup that will best fit with the overall goal, recognizing men and women are serving together then in those sectors in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Men and women are serving together in the police, and so we do want to ensure that there are training programs and other areas where they are practicing that.
Does anyone else want to add to that? So, well, thank you with that. Mr. Rafiq.
No, I was going to say that I think sometimes we have to be pragmatic and recognize that in some countries, for example, I don't know, let's pick Saudi Arabia, if we were wanting to run programs in Saudi Arabia, it's just not going to be possible to be able to currently have programs where men and women are actually being trained together. And sometimes we have to take low-hanging fruit and eventually work to a situation where we can get and empower those countries to be in situations where they can have men and women working together and training together.
Great. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'm going to ask the last two witnesses the question that I asked the first two witnesses, and I'm sure you remember the question. The question was, what can we do right now about this issue? Ms. Popal?
Yes.
And I want to thank you, I want to thank all of you, but I'm fascinated with your background, and you have a tremendous insight into this this very specific issue, as all four of you do. But go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about
Microphone on?
two issues. Oh, it is. I wanted to talk about two issues just briefly. The first one is just reiterating the importance of education and really building critical thinking skills in women to be able to challenge some of these extremist narratives and allow them the confidence and the voice to be able to speak up and do that. There have been studies out there that have interviewed women, and unfortunately there is not a lot of robust data on the role of women in countering violent extremism in Afghanistan, but what does exist really points to the fact that women do get listened to within the household, but a lot of times they don't have the confidence or they don't have the knowledge or they don't have the education or the literacy to be able to push back in a way that makes sense. So that would be one thing. The other point I wanted to talk about is just the importance of advancing economic opportunity. We at the Bush Institute are working on promoting a women's leadership program that focuses on women who are advancing economic opportunity for everyone, not just for other women in their communities and their countries. And this is a multi-country program. It spans the Middle East, North Africa, and Afghanistan. And it's an effort to really show the value that women bring to societies as a whole. So again, education and economic opportunity are two ways that we can work toward sustainable development in Afghanistan, and that in and of itself will help counter violent extremism.
Biggio, you could be brief. We would appreciate it.
Thank you. Right now, the White House has the pen in developing a new national counterterrorism strategy and a new national strategy on countering violent extremist groups. These should include attention to women as enablers and mitigators of terrorism, and it should include a specific objective and focus on these issues. Second is investment. As the budget is set, women are on the front lines already doing this work, and the U.S. government has done little to support them. This means ensuring that there are more both economic support funds available, as well as ensuring that the U.S. government's security funds, whether anti-terrorism or our funds to support police and military, that these pots are also used to support women in the security sector and ensure that they have an opportunity to serve more. To Mr. Keating's earlier question of the importance of increasing security cooperation efforts to support more female representation in police and military, there are women in the U.S. in police that could be training more of their counterparts. This is a decision in terms of contractors. We should ensure domestically we're leading by example. We're supporting the opportunities for women to serve in the military and police here, and that they then have the opportunity to serve to help train and support their counterparts around the world.
Thank you. I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
This is a quick round, so I'll only ask one question. We've learned this afternoon, how much research, decades of research is being done, and how, with our 11 indicators or more, we have more information. As we get that information, what is our State Department, what is the U.S. government, as well as NGOs, doing when you're looking at where maybe the next wave of extremism is going to come? Countries like Bangladesh, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, we know what's happening there. It would make great sense to me if we know these indicators and can get information on this. How well are we doing trying to get ahead of the curve a little bit there?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because that's the question I've been asking myself. I received a 4-year, $1.3 million grant from the Defense Department to do this research, and I'm having an awful hard time finding anyone in the Defense Department who would like to actually read this research or listen to this research. So I'm searching for partners within the Defense Department who can take what we've done on the Defense Department's dime and begin to integrate it into intelligence and early warning indicators, and also looking at practices, because nations know that they are destabilized by these practices. For example, the Saudi government has placed a stiff cap on bride prices and wedding costs in order to prevent these types of inflationary bubbles that occur within their society. So I think there's a lot more to be done. Now, I know in the State Department we do have the Office of Global Women's Issues, but my understanding is that their voice has been muted. We do not have a global ambassador for women's issues, which is a serious lack on our part if we're going to take these issues as importantly as they should be. So I think there's a lot we need to do, but there's, as you say, we already know a lot. What's missing is the action channels to transfer these this knowledge into programs and priorities and funding.
Okay, thank you.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett.
So I want to start out by suggesting that in the year 2018, and I understand that it's not tantamount to purchase, but that any country that institutes any practice that is called bride pricing might be someone who we should consider the nature of our business and interaction with, regardless of their culture, customs, or tradition. I mean, it's a head scratcher. But I could talk about Saudi Arabia and lots of other countries for a long time, and that's not what we're here for. Mr. Rafiq, I kind of gave you short shrift earlier, and I want to give you an opportunity to circle back around. I think my assertion is, however, that in any culture where there's some degree of education and some degree of hope, which is usually provided in conjunction with education, radicalization is less prevalent. I'm just going to give you the floor for the balance of my time.
Thank you. I think that if we look at the term radicalization and radicalism, I think radicalism has often been the preserve of the middle class and the educated class, whether that's far left radicalization or whether that's far right, or whether in this case Islamist radicalization. And the problem that we have, I'm totally in favor of fixing grievances. I'm totally in favor of people becoming more educated, because I think that can help civil society as a whole and can be help to build more resilient communities against a whole range of problems. But on its own, if we just focus on the grievance culture, if we just focus on the grievances, if we just focus on just the education side of it, well, the four of us here probably have our own personal grievances at this very given moment in time. When we go to sleep tonight in our own beds, we'll probably have problems, and my problem to me will be bigger than somebody else's problem, and then tomorrow my problem might be something else, etc. I think that if we just focus on the grievances, we're going to be playing whack-a-mole. We should, as a civil society, educate people more because it will help. We should focus on grievances as a civil society, but if we don't focus on the ideology, we don't focus on Islamism and reverse engineer the intellectual, the ideological, social, emotional, and spiritual aspects of Islamism and Salafi jihadism, we won't fix this problem long term, and that's all I was saying.
So no, and I think we found some commonality, and I'll tell you that it strikes me as interesting that we're, I think we're asking the Saudi Arabia to revise textbooks that they send literally across the globe whilst negotiating trillion-dollar arms deals, right? And I have no problem with an ally like the Saudis so long as they behave in a manner consistent behind closed doors as they do publicly, and that's what makes me shake my head. And I understand that there are cultural differences, and I respect them. And I think that we should respect individuals' rights to live as they choose, but in a society wherein individuals don't get to make that choice, I think that the United States foreign policy should be dictated by who we choose to do business with. It's more efficient than trying to figure out who you need to kill before they kill you. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for your indulgence, and thanks to the members of the panel.
Thank you, gentlemen. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Poe. I think one of the, among other disappointments of this administration has been the cutting off of health funds to women all over the world. Cutting off the funds are cutting off the U.S. Population Fund, which I know does work with trafficking and child marriage prevention. I'd be interested in hearing, I should say on the basis of what I think is a false premise that these organizations and NGOs and so forth are performing abortions, which they're not. But I'd like to hear your opinion on that, and in terms of how cutting off so many millions and millions of dollars towards women's health and preventing some of these practices affects the terrorism.
Well, we know that demographic factors absolutely play into terrorism. Researchers have shown that youth bulges especially are associated with internal instability and conflict within nation states. I have lived long enough to know that women do not wish to have more children than they can take care of. It is when women do not have choice over how many children they have that you get youth bulges. So I think any policy which reduces women's access to means by which they can control how many children they have is at odds with our desire to see the world be a more peaceful place. That having been said, I agree with you that while certainly it's a defensible position to say that U.S. funds should not go towards organizations that perform abortions, I can see that. I think the distinction you made with
incidentally, that's not my position, but that is the position of the United States government.
Right.
Yes.
I can see that what you're saying is that there are many organizations that do not perform abortion, but nevertheless tell women that abortion is an option and send them off to, to sources where that may be had. I think that we, probably do have an interest in seeing those organizations succeed. So I agree with you that it is odd that we have cut off money to organizations that don't perform abortions, but yet apprise women of means by which to control their fertility.
Having access to health care is also one of the barriers that prevent women from being able to engage fully in society. So when they do not have access to the services that they need to ensure their well-being and the well-being of their families, then this is a barrier, again, to a society being able to draw on its full population to promote prosperity and stability. So yes, investment in healthcare, for example, for women and children is part of the full equation to ensure that women and children have the health and opportunity to contribute.
Gentlelady yields back her time. She does. Thank you very much, all of y'all, for being here today. We appreciate it immensely. This has been one of the better informative hearings that we've had in a long time. And I thank you for your time, the information. All of the members of the subcommittee, even those that were not here, may have questions of you, and they will produce those in writing, and then we would like a written response on a timely basis, if you will. But thank you very much. This subcommittee hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks a lot.
That's a good idea.